The Israelis are suffering greatly. If you listen to the military versus the politicians, you often get two different stories because the Israelis have suffered greatly in the war against Lebanon, against the Palestinians. They will be also to some extent extended in Syria. Even the public across Europe is becoming more apprehensive. You all see in the United States because yeah, genocide it seems to be one step too far, and the neighbors as well. I think a lot of them would calculate that if they hate Iran more than Israel, then accepting Israel as a balance to the Iranians would be seen as acceptable. But now that the balance of power has been unraveled, to what extent would they keep their peaceful posture towards Israel now that Iran has departed a bit more from the region?
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today my guest is once more Dr. Glenn Diesen, who's a professor at the University of Southeast Norway and an associate editor at the journal Russia in Global Affairs. Today we want to discuss two of his articles that he recently wrote and published on Substack, both of them of very high importance in order to explain what the currently unfolding events in around Europe and in West Asia mean. The first one will be about why probably a major war in West Asia is now inevitable due to the absence of a balance of power. And then in the second segment, we're going to be talking about the science of anti-Russian propaganda. So, Glenn Diesen, thank you very much for joining me again.
Thank you. Yeah, great to see you again.
Glenn, your first article discusses what this new situation in the Middle East, in West Asia, means, and you are making the point that by now it's very, very hard to avoid a larger war between Israel, Iran, and ultimately that means with the United States. Could you please tell us why you think that we are closer to that point now than even when this direct exchange of missiles happened a couple of months ago?
Yeah, well, first, well, I wrote because I was a bit frustrated by, opening up any newspaper because in the usual template, it's always, democracy and freedom won over authoritarianism and, good versus evil now, things will be, peace has arrived, there will be stability. So, very much fantasy land. So my main argument is exact opposite has happened. That is, Syria has played a very central key point in maintaining the current balance of power. And with this disruption, with the destruction now of Syria, the situation is to a large extent put on its head. And I point out, well, first of all, that the anti-Assad alliance, if you think it's based on freedom, yeah, sure, then freedom might have won. But this is a very diverse group of people and interests who will not likely be able to uphold any solidarity after Assad is gone. And second, the weakened groups, be it then especially yeah, the Palestinians, Hezbollah, Iran, this will also they will also not simply retire. I think this situation will also become destabilized as we now see the Israelis, of course, when they knock out all these minor actors, their main or medium-sized, the main objective, the head of the octopus, whatever. This is always Iran. So this is seen as taking them one step closer to yeah beating the Iranians, and then you'll have peace. Is the assumption. But no, but my idea is that the key actors, the jihadists, which are not also unified, the Turkey, America, the Israelis, all of these various Arab backers, none of them, they have a very competing interest. And what you'll probably see now in the weeks and months to come is without the common objective or the common boogeyman of Assad in Iran, they will to a large extent begin to turn a bit on each other due to this competing interest. And you're already seeing this, by the way.
I mean, we're seeing now how Turkey is fighting openly the U.S. supported Kurds, right, in that is the northeast of Syria, and this puts the U.S. into a dilemma because both of them are basically its allies, and we've seen this time and again, right, how the exit of one actor then really changes the entire dynamic in the system. And the question then basically is whether a new balance is established that is firm and that holds, or whether this now encourages one of the actors to go much further. And we've seen Israel already taking advantage. And by the way, just as a side note, our Western media covering up by calling it a vacuum, right? This is not an attack, this is a vacuum, right? That is being filled, because we know from physics that's what happens when you have a vacuum and air comes in, it fills it back up. So it's a natural thing to happen. It's not an invasion, it's not an illegal attack, it's filling the vacuum. I find that again like fascinating. Um, but do you think that the forces now, especially from Israel and Turkey, are actually will end up in in direct conflicts with either the Kurds or well Iran, because Iran is still one country removed, right? We also in the media we keep hearing now that Israel could directly strike Iran because Syria is out of of the game. They keep forgetting that there's still that there's still Iraq in the
Iran is
way.
there. Yeah.
Um, can you talk to that?
Yeah. Well, also, first, let me just say that I agree that the Turks obviously I think they're already clashing a bit with the Americans, so they have American and Turkish proxy groups are already fighting. But again, even American proxy groups within Syria has been fighting each other. So you have CIA trained and Pentagon trained, and they're also been in clash. So a key part of this is that the jihadists themselves, they're not a unified group. I mean, yes, they do have some common origin, Al Qaeda, ISIS, and HTS being an off branch, but the HTS is considered a fraction. They're not representing the entire region. Furthermore, they're not even Syrian. A lot of them. They have a lot of Uzbekis, Uyghurs. There's many who don't speak Arabic. Some of them might be getting residency or citizenship, of course, because of their contribution in the fighting. But this is hardly the Syrian opposition, which has been sold to the public as. And of course, this jihadists they can't simply come in, this fractured jihadist group come in and overtake secular Syria, and it's been the most secular one in the region without major problems. And of course, I think Turkey believes they can control HTS and the groups they've been backing in Idlib. But now that Assad is gone and they are in Syria, I don't think they can tame this animal which they have unleashed. So you can also maybe see some future tension coming between them. And also within Turkey, again, the Turks would see HTS as an ally still towards destroying the Kurds, for example. But the Americans need the Kurds because with the Kurds, the Americans are able to hold on to a lot of the natural resources, the oil in the northeast of Syria, and holding this oil is important in order for America to have continued influence. So you see a wider tension which would build up, and this idea that America control HTS, it's and civilize them, if you will. This is also, I think, very flawed. Keep in mind that Americans still have a $10 million bounty on the head of Jolani, and the EU is also trying to whitewash while Assad was a regime, this new head choppers in Syria, they're apparently a government and authorities, and they're to be they are to be treated as very legitimate. So we see a lot of throwing around a lot of legitimacy, and I think yeah, it's not going to last to a large extent, and I think we can already see the possibility of it spreading. I think Jordan is quite vulnerable, and also, I think without Syria, there's no Palestine really. They become they become severely weakened at least, given that this is part of a key point of this resistance, and also gives Israel the possibility to put further pressure on crushing Hezbollah. So I think there's a lot of um, yeah, a lot of new frozen conflicts or even smaller hot wars, which will intensify dramatically over the time now that Syria has been destroyed. But I thought it's interesting what you mentioned about Israel bombing as well now, because if we really believe that Syria has been liberated, look at this very violent, extreme bombing campaign of Israel, destroying everything there is in Syria, all of military infrastructure, other infrastructure, essentially making a big mess out of the whole country. This is doesn't really coincide with the narrative that peace has arrived, and now it will be stable. Indeed, you see this being taken as an opportunity um, to completely
Yeah.
destroy the country.
Yeah, and it obviously means that Israel's assessment of the people who are now taking power or the groups is that they will eventually turn these weapons against us, right? Therefore, we need to get rid of the weapons. It's utterly clear that Israel doesn't think that this is militarily a new ally for them. Otherwise, you wouldn't destroy the weapons, right? You wouldn't destroy something that you know you can use yourself or you will be used in your favor, right? So this is not necessarily something that helps Israel. I mean, it only helps them to eradicate the military capability of what is coming next. But two questions. Do you think that isn't it likely that the Turks are now trying to strike a bargain with the Americans, telling them, look, you can have all the oil fields, but throw out the Kurds and we come in and we take over and we fight them so that they can support the PKK. I mean, so that basically PKK is weakened or terminally, but you can keep the oil fields so that you can eliminate from Turkish perspective one more actor. And second question, there is a history in West Asia of America and Israel doing something like horrible with glee and happiness, like destroying Iraq, like invading it. It's like, oh, this is the best thing ever, seven nations in 5 years and stuff like that. Eradicate them. But by doing so, you're actually creating your own next huge enemy, which in the case of Iraq was, of course, Iran, because you took out the strategic rival of Iran, which just created today's very strong, very stable, very well, consolidated and military capable Iran, which is now the main threat and head of the octopus, right? Isn't it likely that what currently is being created by giving Turkey the reins over Syria, that will become in a couple of years down the road the next large, real competitor with Israel?
Yeah, well, on the first issue, I think it's quite. Uh, I think it's quite reasonable to assume that the main actors are trying to come to some kind of a settlement, which is why you're seeing the Americans trying to work with the jihadists. The Americans and Turks certainly will be talking together as well. I'm not sure if this will be possible, a trade-off in which the Kurds can get destroyed, but Americans can hold oil fields, because the Americans will need some proxies to represent them in the region. Otherwise, they simply become direct colonial power. So I think it will be difficult. But on the other hand, I think the United States must also recognize that it could be in a weakened position, because the HDS will not accept the Kurds and their autonomy, and especially to the extent they're controlling vital resources. And the Turks would, think the same way, because well, again, one of the reasons why Syria collapsed so fast was this has been a very long war. The Americans they made a point of this several occasions, which is they will control the resources as a source of influence, while they will block everything else in Syria to make sure that ends up in extreme poverty, that essentially Assad could only rule over rubble. This was the main argument. Now, because of this, of course, the country became weakened. The army would fall apart once better offers came along. But it also then begs the question: to what extent does Turkey and the jihadists accept America having this overarching influence? Now, I think it would be difficult to strike a deal. I think it's not impossible, but they also have other competing interests. So it I think it's going to be difficult. Again, I can't rule it out at this moment, exactly because all the main pieces have been thrown in the air. You don't know exactly where things are going to land. You want to be a bit careful to make very certain predictions, um, but I'm critical of it. And in terms of the unforeseen consequences. Obviously, destroying Iraq was empowered Iran, which kind of shows some of the flawed logic they often have in the US because, well, you refer to the General Wesley Clark's statement. It was after the September 11 attacks. Again, a US general, he acknowledges that he received a memo, he said, in terms of what the war plans of America was, how they could take advantage of the war on terror. And he made the point there, we're going to first take Iraq, but then also Syria. We're going to take Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and of course, finally Iran. But once you knock out the Iraqis, it will strengthen the Iranians. So it doesn't matter in what order you take out these countries, but obviously once you've taken out Syria, it's easier to destroy Libya. No, sorry, Lebanon, and so there's some logic, but also some flawed logic there, I think. And in this instance, I think Turkey would obviously be very much strengthened. Again, I'm a bit critical of their extent they're able to control HTS, but but they are a big power, and the constraint on their influence was just severely weakened. So they will begin to have greater influence. And one of the key issues with for the United States is that the Turks have been they're very insistent on adjusting to a multipolar world order. They want to have a more independent foreign policy. So they even though they're a NATO member, they don't fall in line obediently like the rest of the Europeans. So you therefore can expect an even strengthened Turkey would become even more, well, lack of a better word, disobedient or independent minded or even aggressive. So I think there could be some concerns there. But as you mentioned before as well, when the Turks invade from the north, Israelis invade from the south to, yeah, fill the vacuum, as they say. Um, to what extent would it come in a direct clash? It's hard to say. Again, so far HTS has been hasn't really been willing to criticize Israel much, even as Israel is bombing their country now, which they pretend to rule over. And the Turks, I think, have been a bit stronger in their language against Israel, but again, this is what is theater and what is not. So I think at the moment there's a lot of people who are trying to find a new settlement, but I see this as being unlikely, and I would expect more wars to come.
Maybe last question on this segment. What do you think, or do you see any form of strategy when it comes to Israel here? Because so far the strategy, to my mind, has been to lay waste to the to all countries around it, right? To make sure that anyone who's not completely in line with Israel and US foreign policy is basically broken apart, right? And forced into its own civil wars with itself and kept incredibly unstable, which I mean, time and again, the way the Middle East has been burned in order to strengthen Israel's hand is repeating time and again. But that is not a long-term strategy. That is now helping Israel to expand and to maybe follow this idea of a greater Israel and so on. But it doesn't create you friends, right? It only atomizes your enemies or adversaries. In order to be a stable, proper, well-functioning, long-term, prosperous nation, you actually need to integrate into the region, right? And you need to have friends around you. And I don't see that. I just see that a couple of countries are not direct enemies. Do you think that this strategy of Israel of is going to change in the future? Because it still seems to me that there's no plan to actually consolidate and make friends around it. Even Jordan is not really on the friend list. It's just on the list of countries that Israel doesn't explicitly want to destroy it.
Yeah, well, of course, Israel hasn't been the only one using jihadists. The Americans, well, NATO, Turkey, are also often using jihadists as a way to unleash chaos within adversarial states. And then the assumption is once you topple the government, you can bring stability back. You know, this was the thought in the 1980s and Libya. This is what we're doing now in Syria as well. But I, but obviously, bringing a jihadist state into power in Syria, it might not be in the best interest of uh, of Israel. Of course, at the moment they seem to be celebrating as they've broken the resistance because without Syria, Iran is weakened in the region. Hezbollah and the Palestinians can be broken more easily. So at the moment they see it as a victory, but there's other problems happening. They tend to define every destruction and weakening of adversaries, effectively having your opponents being weakened and having more chaos, that this is in your interest. But I think they are creating a lot of problem for themselves. This Syria will not be a stable neighbor. Of course, it could legitimize using more military force because now they're not freeing Syria. Now they're going to fight terrorism there. So you have reasons to occupy more territory. You have reasons to use your military force. But overall, I think to become very ideological if in Israel because everything seems to be treated as a victory, but the Israelis are suffering greatly. If you listen to the military versus the politicians, you often get two different stories because the Israelis have suffered greatly in the war against Lebanon, against the Palestinians. They will be also to some extent extended in Syria. And as you said, even their friends now, it's becoming very difficult to be an ally of Israel. Even the Europeans now are, at least the public, even though governments are still very much supportive, even the public across Europe is becoming more apprehensive. You all see in the United States because yeah, genocide it seems to be one step too far, and the neighbors as well. I think a lot of them would calculate that as long as if they hate Israel more, sorry, if they hate Iran more than Israel, then accepting Israel as a balance to the Iranians would be seen as acceptable. But now that the balance of power has been unraveled, to what extent would they keep their peaceful posture towards Israel now that Iran has departed a bit more from the region? So you can see more hostility in the future, not just from Turkey, but also probably from Egypt. And yeah, you brought up Jordan. I think this is important as well. Keep in mind that half the population there are of Palestinian descent, and they have a very strange position towards Israel. Because on one hand, the government is working with Israel, with the United States. They've been helping with destabilizing Syria during the past decade or more. Well, yeah, it's been 14 years now, and but the public is quite appalled by what's happening with the Palestinians. So the whole situation in Jordan could unravel, and if it happens, it could happen quite fast. But it remains to be seen, and this will be also a huge disruptor. This is Israel's longest border with a neighboring country, um, and yeah, some same dynamic as in Turkey. The Turks obviously they've been helping Israel to some extent by helping them knock out the Syrians. Erdogan talks a big game about the Palestinians, but at the end of the day, he, they they don't do much. So you can have a growing tension between the public, for example, in Turkey, which is very secular, and what's the Turkish government's doing in Syria. So there's a lot of things that can go very wrong very quickly. And for Israel, I think yeah, their enemies are, well, the adversaries are, they can make them more desperate as they become weakened, but also but also their friends are getting uh, more apprehensive about backing them. And within Israel, you have growing internal tensions. You're having an exhausted Israeli army, and all of it's betting on the idea that, if they can just make it to the next war and knock out Iran, for example, then everything will be fine. We just need to bring the Americans in. But then, of course, you have the Chinese, the Russians, they would not like to see Iran fall. So this is escalating a bit quickly out of control. So I think, uh, yeah, the method for measuring Israeli success, I don't think it's necessarily just breaking your adversaries and creating a little bit of chaos. I think they should use a different methodology.
And sorry, I said it was the last one, but this is the very last question. You brought up Russia and China. Um, do you think that if the analysis is that this larger war with Iran is inevitable now, do you think Russia and China would stand back, or that they might pay the US back in kind for what they did to them? to Russia in Ukraine, and just basically fight a proxy war together with Iran in Iran against the US or against its forces in the Middle East, probably mostly kinetically with missiles and so on, because it is probably unlikely that we will see boots on the ground in Iran, right? Even if there was a war scenario.
Yeah, well, I don't think a war with Iran is inevitable. I think it's definitely the end game for Israel. This is yeah, the head of the beast they see they have to cut off, but and they need the Americans to do so. But to what extent they'll be successful in starting such a war, that is unclear. But I do think that the rest of the region, there's too many, yeah, pieces which have been thrown in the air which won't fit together. So I think a war will definitely come, a larger war, but it doesn't necessarily have to be between Israel and Iran. But of course, it's a growing possibility. Um, with the but if of course the Americans back Israel in an attack on Iran, yeah, I think definitely for many reasons. One, the Russians and the Chinese would want yeah, Iran not to be destroyed like the other long wars we've had in the Middle East. Uh, but also beyond economic and political interest, there's also the push to weaken the United States to do a payback, if you will. And I think probably the Russians have already done this to some extent, aiding Yemen. I don't have any evidence for this, but I assume that they've been looking for some way to have yeah, payback to impose some costs on the United States, because this has been, keep in mind that the US ambassador to Israel, he made this point that in 2015 that, oh, now we have an opportunity to bleed the Russians and weaken them. This was also the logic in Ukraine in 2022. Why did the Americans sabotage the peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia? Well, why would you want a quick end to the war? This is an opportunity to bleed the Russians. So it's always this idea that you gradually bleed your adversaries, which is what happened to Syria, by the way. And so I think both the Chinese and the Russians would like to return the favor to the United States if they had the opportunity. But beyond vengeance, I also think there's a strategic interest to keep them up and going. But beyond this, yeah, but that would be Iran. I think for Syria, the Russians are looking to cut their losses and hand over the mess to yeah, to the US and its allies, because well, what I see now, at least they might negotiate getting maintaining their bases, but they're not betting on it because the Americans will put a lot of pressure on getting the Russians evicted. And so what the Russians are doing now is shipping all their stuff out to Libya, and some might go back home, and yeah, just to reduce their exposure. And over time, I think they will try to negotiate, holding on to the bases, but it seems unlikely, and I can't imagine them wanting to fight over it. Again, who would they fight, and how could they? Yeah, well, what would be the purpose at the end of the day? So I think yeah, a lot of the changes are coming.